you used to be able to raise a family on one salary, to not have to think about your retirement so much. That's not the case anymore. Following the default path isn't going to get you to where you want to be.
Rob Dix is a finance expert and host of the Property Podcast. His new book is called 7 Myths About Money.
If you don't know what makes you happy, if you don't know like what you're like, how you behave, then you can't get it right.
I think having this conversation is one of the most valuable things an investor can do.
Regardless of what the markets do or whatever else, whatever happens with the national debt, you can make your life better by doing things a bit differently.
You say that basically every aspect of life is better than it has ever been before, apart from money. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, I personally wouldn't want to go back to any time in the past, given where we are in terms of like convenience and technology and health and all these things. But I don't think people feel that people are better now than their parents were. There was always this expectation you'd be better off than your parents were. And I don't think people feel that now. And that is only one aspect of life. But money is a pretty important aspect of life. It touches everything. So I feel like people need to act differently and think differently about money. It used to be the case that you could just kind of do what everyone else did and you'd be pretty much okay. And I think the average has been getting worse for most people. And so now if you want to do above average, you're going to need to start doing different things.
I do sometimes. I just want to push back and ask, do you think there's a bit of recency bias? We always tend to have these events that happen in our lives and we think, God, nothing's ever been worse than this. But there was world wars and...
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's just money. Like, I think in every other respect, it's great. And I think even in terms of money, like, things are at the moment broadly okay, but if you sort of look at the financial underpinnings of everything, which is what my last book is about, it's like things are not in a good state. And so like it's probable, I'd say, that things are going to get worse from here at some kind of speed.
I like that in your book you start talking about we have to change our thinking and like change our outlooks, because I feel in past times it was just go to school, get good grades. If you go to uni or good uni or you go to any uni, you're going to get a good job and you'll be fine and your pension will be fine and you'll be fine. But now it's like, do I even want to send my son to uni? And like everything, like going to uni, even doing a master's degree, it's not quite as powerful as it used to be.
Yeah.
And it seems like it's harder to get on the property ladder, harder to do all these things that our parents and previous generations just took for granted. So I don't think it's recency bias. I'm feeling like it's a lot harder than it was for my parents, I think.
And all the financial stuff, all the same financial advice you see now, it comes from like 100 years ago. Like most of it originates in the 1920s. Like, well, the world's changed quite a lot from that. And some of it's timeless wisdom, fair enough, but some of it's, well, maybe you need to do things a bit differently now.
You say that average isn't enough anymore, but someone has to be average, right? So are you basically saying that only a handful of people will retire well and most people are kind of doomed?
No, not at all. I just think that I don't think it's a controversial thing that the average outcome is getting less attractive than it used to be. So, it used to be able to raise a family on one salary. You used to be able to have your home paid off by a certain age. You used to not have to think about your retirement so much because it was linked to your job and you just like the guaranteed sum of any money every year. That's not the case anymore. So that used to be the average. Now it's not the average. So the average has got worse, but that doesn't mean it's a terrible situation. Like the world is not a bleak place like for most people, and that's great. But it just does mean that if you aspire to do better than that, then just following the default path isn't going to get you to where you want to be.
That whole get a good job and just, get yourself a career, get a good job, go to uni. It's like a trap now in a sense for a lot of people.
Yeah, I'm still paying. I've got my master's degree student loan I'm paying off. So it's like, now I've got extra
paying
debt.
it.
I know. That I defaulted on.
I love this story. He defaulted and then he was like, yeah, but now they don't charge interest because I've defaulted on the loan.
I paid off the first student loan, but this one was bigger.
So main things about money differently, I'll give him that. There should be a whole chapter.
Yeah, no interest because it defaulted.
Down to a T should be your book. And that's
it.
You pin 1971 or the uncoupling from the gold standard as a key date. Why do you think that was the point that things changed?
So the brief history lesson is you had the gold standard, the dollar was linked to gold, everything else was linked to the dollar. And then 1971 was when that came to an end and you got to a point where money has value because we say so, basically. And that allowed central banks to have far more control over the price of money and the quantity of money. And economists will argue about like how much of that power has been misused, but one way or another, the effect of that has been that debt is now way, way, way higher than it was. If you go back and look at like a graph of debt and money supply for like the last 200 years, you can't even see anything up to the 70s because of the scale, because it's gone up so much since then. And a part of the reason for that is we've been on this trend of like downward interest rates the whole time. So interest rates have been falling. A part of that is because whenever there's some kind of crisis, there's the ability and the temptation to like reduce interest rates, print some money, get the economy going again. So every time something goes wrong, which it does every so often, that's been the response. And that's how you ended up with post 2008 interest rates next to nothing. You had COVID again, loads of money printing. And that's the trajectory that we've been on for 50-ish years. Then you hit 2022, give or take, when interest rates suddenly stopped being zero and sort of went back up to their long-term average. And that's why I sort of pin that as a start of another new era, because we had this whole period of like falling interest rates, inflation not really being a thing from the 90s onwards. And then suddenly it's like, oh, like the world has changed again. And I don't know if anyone's fully appreciated yet just what a big shift that is.
Do you think the long-term trend of declining rates will continue again when we have another inevitable shit show?
At some point, there will be another catastrophe and rates will come back down to a lot lower than they are. But in this kind of long-term structural decline that we had for such a long time, that was a gradual process that went on for decades. And when interest rates fall, most asset prices benefit. So you had stocks, bonds, property, everything going up at the same time, or everything benefited. That's a big part of the inequality that gets talked about a lot, because people who had assets when all this started happening and could borrow to buy more ended up doing really well. People who didn't lost out. And so that's a trend that's been playing out for a long time. It's come to an abrupt end. I do think at some point another catastrophe will strike and rates will go back down. But it's going from like 0 for 15 years to 5% is a massive adjustment very quickly.
Especially when debt levels and asset prices have scaled to a point that, you know, those interest rates are big on those chunks. So in the 90s, say, the debt burden was nowhere near, was it?
Exactly, yeah, that's it. So like 5% or wherever we are now is like close to the historical average. It's not abnormal. 0 is abnormal. 5% is normal. What's not normal is having that kind of interest rate when you've got as much debt as we racked up for the last sort of 40, 50 years.
There was a point in that you made that kind of made me think, where you said prior to 1971, productivity was correlated to wages, and post that was broken. And this kind of speaks to the inequality thing that you were talking about. What have you observed there when you studied it?
It's really striking when you go back and look at all these charts. It's just like that the early 70s is the step change for so many things. So many trends suddenly change, and productivity and the gains of productivity is a big one. And it's beyond my abilities to kind of tease out all the different factors, and no one can agree on it anyway. But it definitely feels that as a result of everything being financialized and the amount of debt and everything else, the gains of productivity have not been going to the people who are doing the work.
Do you think that we are inherently addicted to debt on a national and individual level?
Massively, yeah. I mean, I'm not just talking about governments. Like the pattern's the same for individuals and for companies, but at a position where like the government has to borrow money every single year. It's impossible for it not to. It's like, you might remember like the whole decade of austerity and all that kind of thing. That the aim of that was to get rid of the deficit. So just gets back to break even. And I think they got there or nearly got there or something. And then COVID happened. But now that's not even spoken about anymore. Like no one's even talking about trying to get back to break even because it's impossible. So you're just locked into this pattern where you just have to keep borrowing more, which was all right when money was like next to nothing and the interest rates were really low. Now they're not. And so as time goes on, more and more of the debt pile is going to have to get refinanced at higher levels. And so it's not a situation you'd want to be in. And it feels normal because we're used to it, but you wouldn't design an economy to run that way.
I was reading around the book. So I was doing some research about, how did they get through these debt crises in the past, because it's happened in ancient history or a few hundred years ago. And they used to have these things called like debt jubilees, where the leader would just go, all debts are white. and the whole, and obviously the people who lent money would be like, oh, he's done it again. these debt jubilees, and they just write the book clean almost. And I know that inflation can be sometimes described as the modern day debt jubilee. And do you think then that in a debt-based economy where we have such high debt rates, that inflation is almost going to need to be necessary to reduce that burden?
Definitely, yeah. The only things you can really do is you can pay off the debt. Not going to happen. You can reduce the value of the debt in real terms, which is basically you sort of inflate the value of it away. So you might have like a 2 trillion in debt, but that 2 trillion becomes less over time in everyday terms. Or you can sort of, well, there's not much else you can do. The third option is
grow productivity.
Yeah,
but
that feels
loose.
almost impossible,
Yeah,
right? Because they've tried lots of stuff, but also you're having to. The tax burden is so high because it has to be to try and keep everything under control. That could kind of anti-growth. You want to cut taxes and give everything a boost, but they can't cut taxes.
I think there was, not many people realised that inflation actually helped the UK government in terms of reducing their debt burden. It made the debt worth less in real terms. So there's this kind of weird sort of conflict of interest of they don't want high inflation because it's bad for the economy, but actually it will reduce the debt burden in real terms that they have, and they need to borrow because they're addicted to the debt.
Yeah.
So this constant cycle of higher rates and inflation and
you want rates to be high but not too high. And there was some kind of study that figured around up to 4% was around the point, but like people didn't really notice or didn't get angry about it. Obviously, when it's double digits like it has been in recent years, that's a problem. But the official target is 2. But if you get it like 3, 4 and just keep it there, then that's over time. That's quite helpful.
Let's talk about these myths then, because you framed it nicely there that the rules have changed, or at least the rule that has dominated, which is a declining interest rate, is reversing, and that means that the rules might be different for people today. There was you set out a collection of myths. I wanted to go around the table and maybe pick out some of the favourites rather than go through each individually. I especially want to hear Tamane's because, like I said, you could write a whole book on it. I know what his will be. Surely it's the risky one.
Of course it's a risky one.
You basically said take more risks. This guy's going to be at the casino tomorrow going, Rob sent me. I'm here. This is all good.
Risk minimization myth. I love it. I love it so much. So I think it says that the myth is that you should always try and de-risk or minimize the risk that you have. But you actually say that there's no correct way to invest, which I definitely agree with. Thank you. It's like you're preaching for me. And it really matches your motivations, your lifestyle, and like your appetite for risk, and that it's not bad to actually look for more risky because then you're hopefully getting more returns.
Yeah, I think so I lay it out in terms of like everyone's got 3 motivations when they come to investing. You want to protect your money. You want to make sure your lifestyle's okay. You want to maintain it even if you're working less or you eventually retire. But then you also want to improve your lifestyle. Like everyone, to some degree or other, wants to like move up the wealth distribution from where they are now. They want to be better off than their friends.
You want to level up.
Exactly. Everyone wants that. And some people really want that. Some people just a tiny bit. But everyone has all 3 to some extent. But when you look at most financial advice or like books or whatever, they just focus on the first 2. People tend to talk about protection and maintenance, and the drive to improve, I think, gets ignored, and that causes a problem because people go and talk to a financial advisor, and the financial advisor will talk to them about like annuities and diversification, all this stuff, which is important, and everyone will like nod along politely. But then when they see a house on their street come up for sale, go, oh, we can flip that and make some quick money, because that drive is still there to improve. And so I think you have to recognize all 3 of those motivations. And so if making an improvement is important to you, which it can be, like there are a lot of people who feel like they don't have much to lose, and so it's more important to gain than to maintain. And so it's just a case of like recognizing that and doing that in a safe way and an intelligent way, rather than like going and like gambling. And this is not like me giving permission to go out and like get involved in meme coins and all that kind of thing, because like you can do it, but you got to do it in an intelligent way. Yeah. But I think because a lot of people aren't getting validation on that, they're going and doing it in ways that are not so smart.
A bit loose, yeah.
Can we just break down the buckets a bit more, and what different demographics might putting them at different times? Because
Yeah.
I think that might shift over time as well.
For sure. So this came from some work done by a guy called Ashwin Chabra, which is he identified these sort of all assets can be divided into one of three buckets. So you've got protect, which is basically making sure that if something bad happens, you're okay. So an emergency fund is like the most obvious version of that. He put your home in there, as I would. That's controversial. People think their home's going to make them rich, but we can go into it. But I think that home is protective because if you've got a paid off home, whatever things go wrong, all good, you've got your home. Then you've got maintain. So that's your compounding portion. So if you've got your diversified index funds, that's going to grow at some percent on average over time. It's not going to make you rich, but it's going to enable you eventually to sort of ease off on work and stop work while maintaining your current lifestyle. But it's not going to make you like super mega ultra wealthy unless you let it compound for years like Warren Buffett did. Like he made 95% of his money after he was 60 or something. That's because he's been compounding for such a long time. But if you want to change your life in the short term, or you want to like have your name on the side of a building one day or something, then index funds aren't going to get you there. You need to do something. You need to take more risk, and that could still be in the stock market, but being taking more concentrated positions, things that can like rocket up in value. It can be investing in property. It can be things like that, where it's more risky, but it's got the potential to give you outsized returns. So the point is that anything you can invest in can only serve one of these motivations at a time. So you need to figure out which is the most important to you. Because if you had enough money that you could invest in everything, it wouldn't even be a conversation. But everyone's going to have to choose. So it's like, okay, what's most important to me right now? And that's the type of investment to focus on.
But they can have an allocation to index funds and be paying off a mortgage, but then carve out a piece of their finances to roll to try and become rich or wealthy.
Yeah, and that's why I think having this framework, I find it really useful because it's like it simplifies a lot of stuff. Because like if you get people obsessing about like which index fund, or it's like the fees are like 0.03 versus 0.04 or whatever. It's like it doesn't really make that much difference because it's all the same type of thing. Yeah. If you're hoping it's going to make you rich, it's not. So don't worry about it. So if you just get the balance right, maybe it's like 10% to the risk taking, maybe it's 0%, maybe it's 50. It depends on who you are. But if you get the balance right between the three, then the absolute detail doesn't matter so much. It kind of simplifies everything.
I'm all in on YouTube, right? Essentially, I'm all in on content creation, and I'm taking a lot of risk. I quit my job that was 100K a year, so that was the investment that I made.
Yeah.
But underneath that is a bedrock of boring index funds that mean that even if this doesn't work, I know by retirement I will be okay. The biggest change in the finance space in the last couple of years has probably been interest rates. We're now in this new era, having been at historically low rates for over a decade. The downside is we've seen mortgage rates increase, but the upside is we've seen savings rates increase as well. The funny thing is though, a lot of people, particularly business owners, have been slow to jump on this increase in rates. Are you getting a good interest rate on the cash that's sat in your business bank account? I wasn't until recently. This is why I'm happy that we're partnering with Tide. They offer an instant access saver account where new customers can get 4.07% AER variable on unlimited deposits until at least the 31st of March 2025. If you're interested in putting the money in your business account to work, head to tide.co/savings. There's a link in the description for you. For the full offer T's and C's and Tide's terms, visit tide.co/terms. Variable rates are correct as of the 7th of November 2024. You say it's personal. Maybe you could give your thoughts on how you do it in your life. How are you allocating to each one?
Yeah, it is personal. I sort of lay out lots of different shapes, and it very much depends on like where you are in life. It depends a lot on age, but not just on age. It depends on earning power. So if you've got someone who's 20 years old and they're training to be a doctor, they're going to have very different future earnings expectations from someone who's 20 years old and has no qualifications and is working a minimum wage job. So it's not just age, but that's a big part of it. So that comes into it, but also like your risk appetite, how you feel about things, like how much you want to gain versus not lose. All that comes into it, and kind of determining like the overall shape of your investments. And there's lots of different ways of doing it. I think the normal one is like you get your house, that's your protection. and then you go and do your index funds, your diversified kind of stuff. That's your maintenance, and then maybe there's some improving at the end if there's anything left over. And for many people, most people probably, that is the right thing to do. But it doesn't have to be that way. It could be, actually, I've got protection because I've got the ability to earn money, or I've got family I can live with, or whatever, and I really want to make a move up from where I am now, so I should be going and doing more aggressive stuff than someone might tell you to do if you're sort of sticking purely to this framework. So it's hard to kind of tease out all the different factors, but it is going to be different for everyone. Yeah. And I think your earning power is a big part of it. So like you are taking more, risk with your time, with your skills, with your ability to generate income. And so therefore you probably want to play it safer with your actual investments. For someone else, it could be different. And I think most books you see about this treat saving, earning, and investing as totally different things. And you might get one book which will only cover one or two of them, but I think you have to take all of it together because it's all part of the same
your portfolio.
Thing. Yeah, exactly.
It's like your life is the portfolio. Yeah. I see that all the time of people that go, I'm working a job and maybe they're unfulfilled, and then they go, okay, I stick everything into an index fund, and then it's like, okay, that's it. Whereas if someone just said, break 10% off and go roll the dice, that might change your life. And that's what I essentially did. I invested time, which was the resource that I put into it. It wasn't money. It grew. And then as you're getting more confidence, I've swung more and more towards, okay, this is what I do. I went on a property podcast the other day for a company I used to work for. And the lady who was interviewing me, she's been really successful in property investment. And she was like, people always tell me it's so risky that I'm just in property. And I was like, but that's what you know. You sell property, you can see all the best deals, you buy them before they hit the market.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't be overexposed to expertise like that, And
Totally.
she, I said, maybe you just want to get some index funds as your, the safety net, like you say.
Yeah.
So, approach it in that way. How do people that are working a day-to-day job find these opportunities for that last bucket without just taking stupid risks on?
Yeah, I think that's the reason that this doesn't get talked about much, especially by proper financial advisors, which I'm not one, is because it's such a hard question to answer and it's personal for everyone, and there's no guarantee of success. Like you could say, like, if you put your money in a global tracker, you can be pretty sure, based on everything we know, that you'll get to roughly this point in some period of time. With the kind of the riskier stuff, you have no idea. Like, it could work, you could lose everything. You just don't know. So I think a lot of it comes down to getting the balance right, because like if you put everything into something that doesn't work, that could be a disaster for you. It might be okay, but for many people it would be a disaster. So just like do an appropriate amount. If maybe for you that's 10%, maybe it's 30%. But if you get that right, then even if it doesn't work, it doesn't ruin you for good. But then when you do it, it's about finding somewhere, developing some kind of area of knowledge where you have an above average chance of making a success of it. Because I think when everyone's into NFTs and meme coins and all this stuff, that was basically gambling, because most people didn't have any particular knowledge of it. They just wanted something to make them rich. And you see that attitude, it's a lot, because these are opportunities that are getting presented to you, like people sort of selling drop shipping courses or whatever, all the stuff that you get is because people go for these opportunities because that's what is presented to them. But you need to have some expectation that you're going to have, there's a reasonable chance of it working out for you. And so even if you're not in a position to actually, even if you don't have the money to do it now, you could at least start developing that knowledge early, because then by the time you do start investing, you've got a better chance of making it work. You don't want to have a strategy that's based on hope. You want to feel like you can do something about it.
Yeah, I hope the next 100 years of market returns are the same as the last.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, don't want people to listen and go, God, why am I in index funds? But I do think the message of it's your base, and then you go out there and you try and leverage your own skills on more high risk stuff to deliver returns is a good one.
I think but coming back to index funds, I think for most people, that is a super worthwhile thing to do. But what's not worthwhile is trying to squeeze out an extra 1 or 2% returns, because you probably won't be able to do it. And if you spent the equivalent amount of time getting qualifications or finding ways to earn more, you're going to make so much more from doing that, which you can then put back into the markets.
It reminds me of Guitar Hero in the sense of when we were at school, there was this kid who could play the Guitar Hero on the hardest setting behind his back, not looking at the screen. And then this girl just went, "Why don't you learn to play guitar?" And it was just, I could see he was broken in that moment. But that would have been a skill that he could have used to earn money. But instead, and I think, like you say, with the index fund investing, it's kind of that vibe of, people obsess so much. I think people just obsess over things, don't they? I obsess over the colours of thumbnails and titles, but that is a high payoff obsession.
Yeah.
Whereas obsessing over, should I include small cap or not, is not.
Yeah, exactly. If you go and do the back testing, like try and produce a massive difference, it's hard to do. It doesn't, any kind of difference you can produce by fiddling around with stuff like that will be so much more outweighed by if you could just go and earn an extra $5,000 a year by whether that's by getting a promotion, getting a qualification, switching industry, whatever. And there is risk in all of that, like you say, but it's risk that is highly likely to pay off in the end.
And it's more in your control.
Exactly.
What was your favourite myth?
It was the same one, boringly enough.
That's my boy.
Well, we need more conversation, so pick another one.
I mean, it's funny that you just said that the home is like, so for some people that's a safe, like the security is the home, and then like for the personal bit, but then you also have a home ownership myth, which I think is quite interesting.
You don't even live, I mean, it's well documented, but for people who don't know, you rent your home, but own loads of other homes, don't you?
Yeah.
You're both an evil landlord and an abused tenant.
Does that mean on average I'm all right?
You're right. You can see both sides of the coin.
Yeah. I don't know.
So your view of home ownership is probably different, and I think people should listen, because this is one area of finances that I think will definitely change as a result of higher interest rates.
Yeah, and I think this is something where it's easy to get the wrong end of the stick. I'm not saying you shouldn't own a home. I'm just saying it is a discussion. It is something to think about. For the majority of people, it is going to be the right thing to do to buy a home when you can. But I think so many people feel like they're failing if they don't own a home. But it doesn't. You don't have to do it that way. So the way I frame it is like you have to own assets, but you don't have to live in your assets. So I like property. There's benefits of it in terms of leverage and all this kind of stuff. So cool, I own it, but I just don't live there, because even if it was financially the best thing for me to do, which I don't think it is because of where I live, I still wouldn't want to, because I like the flexibility. But I think your home is so personal. It should come down to feelings rather than finances. And for most people, they want that security. That's fine. Renting is terrible, and so I get it. But also flexibility is important. And I know so many people in their 20s who bought because they're told that's the type of thing to do. Suddenly, they can't move for a job opportunity somewhere else, or they sort of get a partner, they want to move in together, they can't sell their own place, suddenly they're an accidental landlord. It's like, it happens a lot.
Happened with my friend. He bought in southeast London like 10 years ago. It took him, I think, no, more than 10 years ago. It took him about 3 years to sell the property, and now he lives with his wife in Putney.
Yeah.
But it took him so long to shift it, and he was like, "Oh my god, I thought it would be a lot easier than this."
Yeah.
I like your idea. Whereas my parents would be like, they just bought a house. Everyone was like, buy a house. My friends were like, oh, get on the property ladder, bricks and mortar. It's very safe. But I don't think it's for everyone if you want to.
Look who's giving you the advice as well. Yeah. You know, the amount of people that take advice on how to get wealthy from people that are not wealthy is pretty staggering. Yeah. And, you know, you question, like, your nan goes, oh, just buy a property because she just fluked buying one place in the 50s and made millions, but has nothing else in her life. And then you get millionaires that sit here like Timothy Army, or maybe even, you know, yourself, who go, it's too expensive to buy my own home. The stamp duty costs, the lack of flexibility. And it's like the people with all the money are saying, I don't own my home. You know, there's probably something in that.
Yeah, and I think the only reason to go, well, I must buy as soon as possible, is if you believe that property will uniquely go up faster than anything else. And that tends not to be the case. Like, there was a brief period in the early 2000s when property absolutely flew up in value. And a large part of the reason that it hasn't recently so much is we're still kind of working our way through that sudden run up. So if you own from before that run up, you're going to think property is the best thing in the world. But in general, it's not. Even if it was, you could buy investment property rather than living in your property. So yeah, it's not the be all and end all, even though, I mean, even if most people, when they come to retire, say you definitely want to own your own home, you want to own it outright. I'm not saying that's necessarily for everyone still, but even if you did, it doesn't mean you have to have owned it from the time you're 20. You can sell off some of your other assets and buy it at that point.
build up a big asset base and then buy a home at some point in cash or whatever.
Yeah, but you have to own assets, and I think one of the appeals of property is it's like a forced saving plan. Like you have to pay your mortgage, and when you're paying your mortgage, you're paying off a bit of a capital. Like there is no choice but to do that if you want to stay in your home. So that's quite nice. But you could take the same amount of money and go and invest it in something else. So you just have to have the confidence in yourself that you are going to do that.
Yeah, because I have, I'm probably overweight the equities or the stock market. And I had this conversation with one of my mates who owns a load of terraced houses in the centre of Liverpool, and they do well for him. And he's always like, property, man, I can see it, I can touch it. And I was like, there's my portfolio. I just get my phone out and put it there. And I was like, I could sell that right now and have all the cash. How long is it going to take you to sell your 10 terraced houses?
Yes, for sure.
I think there's pluses and minuses, isn't
Absolutely.
there? But I think people should challenge the logic of bricks and mortar is everything.
Definitely.
What's your favourite?
We'll get to that in a second. I want to first of all challenge another kind of maybe contradictory or what you say about budgeting. I think will make some people go, "Oh God, this guy's mental," or maybe you just got so much money it doesn't matter. But you say that you don't think budgeting is something that people should do.
Not for everyone. Again, it's offering an alternative. Like for all this stuff, there's loads of advice out. You can pick and choose what you want to pay attention to. And for many people, again, budgeting will be something that they want to do or have to do. If you feel like you need to do it, like if money is like that ultra tight, which it is for many people, you should probably be budgeting. If budgeting makes you feel better and it makes you feel in control and it helps you, then do it. But I think there are people who don't find that helpful. It locks you into a sense of scarcity. And that scarcity is obviously true, but sometimes it's helpful not to overly focus on it. And so another way of approaching it is I used to be a budgeter, and then I went into a stage of I just tracked everything that I spent. And I found that if I just wrote down everything that I spent each day, I found myself spending less. Just because I had that awareness of it. And before spending something, I go, am I going to feel good about writing this down in a few minutes' time? And it made a big difference. And it's for the same reason that, like, if you want to lose weight,
You need a big pad and paper.
we did an episode on budgeting, and I'm like, I'm going to take this all on board, and then I got home and I did not take any of it on board. Spending, just wasting money. So I think that's really, really, that's like very actionable for most people, especially if you're like compulsive spender like me or very impulsive. If you write down, if you know you're going to write it down and look at it at the end of the day, you're like, did I really need like that triple cheeseburger? I could have got a double.
Yeah, and that's why it can't be automated. Like you can obviously hook up your bank and whatever, and it'll categorize everything for you because you've got to write it down yourself, or otherwise it doesn't work. So I don't do that now, but I think it's a great way of like bringing yourself under control a little bit if you need to. It's like if you want to lose weight, if you just start tracking your calories, you will lose weight.
Even if you just weigh yourself every morning.
Yeah, even if you're not trying to lose weight, it just will happen, and it's exactly the same theory.
That which is measured grows.
Absolutely,
or whatever. Yeah, so I was a budgeter when I was in debt and skint, like you said, and it really helped me. And then it became a tool of kind of, it made me feel bad about myself because I never stuck to it, if that makes sense. Once I got more money, what I tend to do now is budget the fixed costs, as in I know exactly what the amount I need to take out my business is every month to pay my fixed bills. I then have an amount on a card, and it's like once that's gone, Damien, it's gone.
Yeah.
And it's invariably always gone.
Yeah.
But I don't say, I'm going to spend X amount on haircuts and this and this.
I can tell.
Thanks, mate. So you were waiting for that.
I know.
You had that loaded, didn't you? You had that locked and loaded, mate. So I can see how over time it transitions. And I do think it's important to say that you can't offer a structure to every single person in every single setting. No. And I think a lot of what you do talk about is for people that have got a bit of cash that are just wondering what's the best way to do it.
That's it. I feel like so much of what you see out there is just like the same thing over and over again. And it's like, that's great. Most of it probably makes sense. But if you chuck in some new ideas, maybe some of them will make sense to you, some of them won't. And that's okay. But you might as well give it a try. And I really feel like most people only have so much time and energy and mental focus to give to the money side of things. Like we choose to be here talking about it today, so we're a bit weird, but most people have got things they'd rather be doing. So like maybe if budgeting is taking up all your money headspace, that's probably a waste of energy when you could go and deploy that with earning more or whatever and end up coming out far further ahead.
Yeah, that was a lesson that I had to learn for myself in terms of I think if I said to people I spend hardly any time thinking about finance and investing, they might be like, what? You do that for a living? What I think about is how to make content on those topics, because that's the activity that drives the results in my life.
Yeah.
And my personal finances are super boring.
Yeah.
Automated and just invest. My favorite one was the early retirement myth, because this is a story that I told myself for 10 odd years, probably 15, that I'm just going to retire early and I'll be happy. And my partner was just like, you ain't never stopping working. You get up on Christmas Day and you're like in your studio like this. And I have to tell you, I did that on my birthday. I poured 43,000 peas over myself. Like petit pois, like the peas.
Petit pois.
Yeah. It was like a representation of property growth and expected returns. And my missus was like, it's your birthday, what are you doing? And I was just like, she's like, you're never retiring. And I think, this whole thing of like, I'll be happy when, is kind of an extension of that, isn't it? You need to find a time to be happy now.
Yeah, totally. I think that's it. Like, there's a big movement about early retirement, and I think lots of it is really helpful. But I do think that if you are the kind of person who's able to retire early, you almost by definition won't enjoy being retired early.
Yeah.
Because you got yourself to that position.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a bit of an outdated concept? Like it was, because I know when I was young, I was like, I'm going to retire by the time I'm 40 and become a philanthropist and just.
How's that going?
Yeah, I know, mate. I've got bills. Massive failure.
Come for my hair, mate. I'll come for your soul.
I'd be crying in the corner. But like, I thought I was going to retire 40, travel the world. But like now I'm like, I would just get bored. Like I've got too much energy. I want to do something. Like even if it's working from home or like being a philanthropist, running a business, like I will always be doing something even in my 70s. Like, so, and now we can because we've got working from home and like cameras and remote work and Zoom and all these things. So it's a bit easier to work later in life if you enjoy what you're doing.
And I think that's the key. It's enjoying what you're doing. Because you don't want to be in a position where you have to work forever. You want to be in a position where you don't have to, but you choose to because you enjoy doing it. And so chances are you're going to want to do it anyway. Most people are going to have to work for longer than they'd really like to anyway. Like the whole thing about like retiring at 65 or whatever. It's like, I think the average age, the most common age of death for a woman in the UK is 89. So you could if you work it out, you could end up spending a third of your life in retirement. And that's
based on people that were born decades ago.
Yeah.
So current generation, fast forward 40 years, it might be 90, 95.
Exactly.
And I think when we're talking about changing dynamics, I think changes around retirement and what retirement are is a crucial conversation that people need to have with themselves in terms of, I might be retired as long as I worked. So unless I save up a lot of money, I probably need to work in some way.
Exactly. Can you save up enough in 30 years of working to sustain you for 40 years without working? Probably not. Like, your investment returns would have to be insane. But the great thing is, like you said, we've got the flexibility now where you can work in a more flexible way. So if you can find something you enjoy doing, find a way that you can add value in a flexible way. So it's not taking up all your time. It's not something where you're missing your grandchildren growing up or whatever, then great. I just think most people like doing stuff that's useful and that they're good at. That doesn't mean they necessarily like working, but if you can find something that you like that's useful to the world and that you're good at, and find a way of doing that forever, you're probably going to be happier for longer as long as you can balance that out with other parts of your life. But it shouldn't be like all work and then all leisure.
Just like in the coal mines for 60 years and then just like chilling for like 20, 30 years.
I think the issue was when work was hard labor, most people were broken by the time they retired, right? And then they died 10 years later. Whereas now it's, if you're a doctor or a finance professional or a content creator, by the time you're 70, you've got such a wealth of experience that you're so valuable as a consultant or whatever.
Massively.
It's that kind of, it's work of the brain rather than work of the hands. Obviously, there's lots of people who do work with their hands, though. What would you say to someone that's a builder who goes, I'm going to be shot at 65?
I think there's still, I don't have any knowledge of that side of things, but I would assume there's going to be lots of opportunities to pass that knowledge on, right? Because from doing it for that long, you're going to have this knowledge and education, but that there'll be ways where maybe you're not there like laying the bricks yourself.
Buy my course.
Exactly.
Or start a business, like a building company, and then hire people.
Start a business, train people, do whatever. There's always going to be ways, but I think that's why it's important to start having this awareness early, so you don't get to whatever age and then go like, right, now what? I don't want to do this anymore, but what do I do next? If you can start thinking about that 10, 20 years earlier, then that's helpful.
There's nothing in business as important as trust. To be honest, my whole business is about trust. And that's why, if you're running a business, proving trust through your security programs like GDPR is as important as it gets. Vanta helps centralize program requirements and automate evidence collection for frameworks like SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more. So you save time and money and build customer trust. Plus, with Vanta, you get continuous visibility into the state of your controls. Join more than 8,000 global companies like Flow Health, Synthesia, and Alaka Bank, who trust Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. This is the new way to handle risk, governance, and compliance. And you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you visit vanta.com/makingmoney. There's a link in the description for you. You outline like an 8-step plan that people can implement to maximize what they're putting into their buckets and to take control of their finances. The first one you start with is making easy cuts to your spending. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
So we've talked about spending already. It's like and the reason for like saying you don't have to do budgeting if that doesn't work for you is spending is like the least powerful tool you have. Like you have to do it. Like you have to be spending less than you're making, otherwise nothing works. But you can't cut back to zero. So it's like there's only so far you can go. So that's why I talk about making easy cuts to your spending in terms of like, cutting the subscriptions you're not using, doing whatever you need to do to get your everyday spending under control. But just get it to do the stuff that doesn't feel hard, because there's also this whole thing about like you need to just look after the future, but you need to live for today as well. And there's some certain experiences you can only have at certain stages of life. So it's like not worth having no holidays and like missing out on going on holiday with your friends in your 20s and 30s, because you might not be able to do that in the future. So just do the stuff that's easy, and then you sort of can flip onto the like, rather than like cutting off back another 20%, can you find a way to earn more? Because then the upside of that is unlimited. So you've got to do the spending, but not give it more focus than it deserves.
Yeah, I remember when I was speaking to you and you were saying, I don't want to do a budget and all of this. And I was like, a budget is actually a tool where you get to decide how you live your life rather than your money just happening. And I think when people are in that early stage where they need to say, this is the life I want to live. For me, it's I want to spend time with my son and I'll spend good money on that. And I want to spend time with my friends and I'll spend good money on that. Mm-hmm. Anything outside of that really probably shouldn't be taking that much money out of me because it's not important to me.
Yeah.
It's not a priority.
That's it. I've got this whole concept of mindful spending, which is basically just like think about it and like think honestly like you have about what makes you happy. Because I mean, lots of us have got ideas about what makes us happy. Sometimes you've got those ideas from other people. Maybe it's things that used to make us happy, but they don't anymore if we just stop to think about it. So I think no one's going to have perfectly optimized spending. Like it's just impossible. But everyone can get closer. So I'm just like, well, get closer and then move on to something else where the upside is higher.
Yeah, like my car doesn't make me happy and I don't really care, but I've got mates who really do. And I might judge them.
My car makes me very, but I always wanted my car since I was a little kid.
Where is it right now?
It's in the garage.
Yeah, where it's broke.
It's broken.
Like you.
I hate her.
Shouldn't have come for my hair, mate.
I know, mate. He took it personally, mate. I'm going to get it for the rest of the week.
That was a misstep.
yeah, you're getting sacked. We got a co-host slot opening up if you want it. Just put on this t-shirt that I bought for him.
Wow, don't let him off the leash now.
Yeah. Something that Tomei might need to do after his impending sacking is the number one is getting protections in place. Mm-hmm. I think this is often not talked about enough. We did an episode on it and people were grateful, but there was another area that were like, oh, I'm being sold insurance kind of things and the protections. Is that the kind of protection you mean? Or do you mean?
Yeah, so you've got your classic emergency fund. Like that's a bit of financial advice that's never going to be wrong. Like you've got to have that. Yeah. And insurance can be a part of that. It's not something I know so much about. And then your home, if you want it to be, because like your home is protection. But as we've talked about, it's not necessarily for everyone. But I do put that in the protection bucket rather than the this is going to make me rich bucket. But I'd put all that stuff in place and then figure how much of that you want and then move on from there.
Yeah, I think the thing about protections are you need them when you have nothing. And I think once you're at a point where you're 50, 60, you might not need an emergency fund, you might not need insurances, but when you're 20 and you're just starting out, a pop tire can rock you and 2 months off work can bankrupt you. So these are the times that you probably think about those things.
Yeah.
Like I've got cash sat in the business now that I don't necessarily need to have an emergency fund, but then something comes up every month and I'm always like, why don't I have a couple of grand outside the business? Because now it's a taxable event.
Yeah, but it's also about what makes you feel comfortable. And like if you look at what billionaires do with their money, they're all completely different. So like even if you go down for billions, just look at people who've just like got tens of millions. So like in any reasonable world, they'd never have to work again. Some of them have like millions of pounds of cash on hand, even though they know it's losing money to inflation. They don't care that it's losing money to inflation because it makes them feel good to know that that's there. And so you could look at that and go, well, that's wrong, but it's not wrong if it makes you happy, right?
I run super lean on the bank account. It to the point sometimes where when I'm about to go to a shop, I have to check that I've got enough money to pay for it.
I do that all the time, but because if I leave money in my bank account, stop. Look, you're not getting a lift in my car for the rest of the year now.
Your car ain't here, mate. Your car is broken.
It will be fine. Temporary little hiccup. But yeah, like if I leave money in my bank account, like on payday, Damo taught me this though. On payday, I move all my money out of my current account, because if I leave it there within a week, I'm just going to spend it. I'll go on a night out and like I'll spend 100 quid tonight, and then in the morning I'll be like, how did I spend 500 quid? So like, I'll walk through Westfield and someone will be like, do you want to buy this? And I'll be like, well, I can, so why not?
Yeah.
So now I just like invest it as soon as I get paid, pay my rent, invest it, just spread it out, and then like don't have any in the current. So like when I check Revolut, every time I go in the shop, I'm like, all right, let me move a bit of money over so I don't decline at the counter. But I think that's
people find that stressful, but I find it kind of like it just keeps me, because I know about myself that I'm reckless, and if I have £10,000 in my bank account, I spend differently. I'm more frivolous.
Definitely.
And it adds up. And I'm not at the point where I can just completely not care, So
no. That's what's so important. Like knowing yourself, knowing what you like, and knowing what makes you happy is the foundation of all of this, which is really hard. Like that's harder than just like following a rule about like where to put your money. Knowing yourself is super hard, but it's if you don't get that right, if you don't know what makes you happy, if you don't know like what you're like, how you behave, then you can't get it right. So it's that self-knowledge.
Yeah, being really intentional about it, and maybe even sitting down and going, at the start of the year, these are the things that I value. These are the things in my day-to-day life that make me happy.
Yeah.
And these are the things that are worth spending money on. And also being honest with yourself that if you're a nutter on a night out, take £100 in cash and that's it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Leave your cards at home. Or
Damien and going out after this, and I've got cash on me, because I'm like, if I bring my card, it's going to get out of control.
Yeah.
Or Damien can pay anyway.
Yeah, it's a business expense. So it's okay. The next one you've got is decide about your home. I think we've already spoken about this. Let's separate home from investment now.
Yeah, big time. So home, like where you live, and so it's if you want to do that, it's about figuring out like, well, how much do you want to do it? Like, do you want to do that? Because again, but you have to make choices. If you could afford to do everything, you would. And so if you want to do that, then like, do you want to get there super quick and like prioritize that over everything? Or do you want to like any money you've got, split that between like saving up for a deposit and putting money into investments? And again, it's just different things from everyone. But I think the reason I put it in there is like it is a choice to make. It's not a default that like you have to be doing the home thing.
Are these in any order? Like,
I think we're flowing through the order.
Yeah, it's an order.
You cut the spending, you have the protection, you decide on what you're going to do with your home. Am I going to make that a focus? I'm going to buy one, I'm going to rent one. Because, some people will just go all in, won't they? And in London, that could take you a decade, even at all in. And then 10 years later, you go, oh, I'm in the house now, but I have no other assets, or I've not been anywhere. So make that decision. Next, you have your bucket, calculating the bucket sizes, which I think we've done. You have the personal choices. What do you mean by audit your maintain bucket?
So I think we haven't talked much about that whole kind of the whole maintenance, like let it compound over time. So I think we haven't talked about that much, but I think by audit it, I mean, just like, is it like, are you doing whatever the right thing for you is, which may be, it's the whole thing, like, should you be 100% in stocks? Should you be having more diversification in there? Figure out what is the right thing for you to be doing. Because like you'll get people who are probably like too heavily in stocks for where they should be. You'll also get people who are not heavily enough in stocks for where they should be. So I've got a whole chapter about figuring out like how much diversification you need, what level of risk is appropriate. And so like really getting your head around all that. And so you're taking on enough risk to get the return, but you also understand that however you slice it, there are going to be painful drawdowns. And I think that's something that, again, like we had 2022 where just like everything performed really badly all at the same time. And there are people who like pulled everything out of the markets at that point because it's, I can't take this, it's gone down too far. It went up by the same amount the previous year. They weren't complaining then, but it's just like, I think you need to either go like, I can deal with that. I know you, when the markets crashed in 2020, I think it was like, you put more in. It's like, great, the market's on sale.
Yeah.
And so like, if you are like that, that's your mentality, fantastic. But if it's not, if you might panic if things drop by 15%, then you need to be looking at that because the whole point of compounding is you just have to leave it.
Yeah,
So
that's what. When you said order, I was like, so are you saying we should tinker with it because you should just leave it, but you should just. And how often should you order? Because obviously tinkering with it's going to affect your returns and the compounding.
Yeah.
And how often should you be auditing?
I'd say it's mostly just like do it once then leave it. So like it's maybe it's fine now, but I think a lot of people will be invested, but you also get a lot of people who are. They invested in an index fund, but the index fund is the US stock market, it's the S&P. Like maybe that's okay, but I'd look at that as like, if the whole purpose of this bucket is I get more diversification, I want to be diversified
Concentrate back.
beyond the US because like it's been the winner for the last however many decades. Is it going to continue being forever? Probably not. Will you be able to pick the next one? Probably not. So I would actually, if the whole point of that bucket is diversification, I'd want more diversification.
Yeah. And just before we move on from this, I think we can all sit here and go, just keep going, keep going. We interviewed a lady called Amy and she was amazing. And she said that she understood all of that. But then when the crap hit the fan, she bottled it. Like she couldn't take it and she pulled out. Have you been through a major decline in asset values, be it property or stocks? And how did you weather that?
Yeah, so I had that in 2020 and then to a lesser extent in 2007, 2008. I didn't have as much back then, but it's still just like, it's still scary to see it happen. But I think that's why it's really easy to just go like, oh yeah, be greedy when others are fearful. Then when it happens, it's a different story. And so
I'm fearful.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So just like you absolutely can't like pull out at like when things are down. So you need to go, okay, like how much risk can I actually live with? And like the more you can educate yourself about it and have realistic expectations, the better. Like the market having a year when they're down 15% should not be a shock. It happens. And so it's like, you need to get to come to terms with that. Like don't have the broker's app on your phone. If necessary, like give your password to someone else who you trust, but just like you need to kind of protect yourself from yourself when it comes to all that.
Having a realistic expectation of what returns looks like is crucial because we quote the average return of say 10%, 9%. If you actually look at 100 years of returns, it's more likely that the year does a minus 20 than it does 10.
Yeah.
Because there's only actually 1 or 2 years that have hit the average.
Exactly.
It's more up 20, down 20, the swings there's volatility, right?
Yeah, that's normal, but I don't think it feels normal to people. And so you've just got to accept that. And again, it's about knowing yourself.
So is that part of the audit of saying, okay, at some point in this journey to retirement or to whenever I want to take out all this compounding, it will be down.
You're auditing yourself.
You're auditing yourself and your annual portfolio, or just really yourself and your mental approach to it?
All of it. So there's lots of different ways of putting together portfolios. So like one from quite a long time ago is called the permanent portfolio, and that's like ultra safe. So you've got like 25% in cash, 25% in gold, and the idea is it really limits your downside, but it limits your upside as well. And so you'll find that maybe if your normal portfolio would have made 9% before inflation over the years, that would only make you 6%. Over 30 years, that's a giant difference.
Yeah.
So you'd rather have 9. But then again, like maybe you wouldn't want to go that far in terms of reducing your risk. But so, well, that would probably, I think the worst year that portfolio has been down 9%, 11%, something like that. Like there's no way of getting lower than that. And so you need to be at least okay with that. And if you're going to go more aggressive than that, you need to be okay with bigger swings.
So if you're a very anxious investor, that would be that would be good for you because you're like, I know I can't take more than 9%, otherwise I'm going to sell it all. So at least this way I can leave it and let it run. So it depends on your appetite.
Exactly.
I think having this conversation is one of the most valuable things an investor can do because it leads to other habits such as getting out of default funds inside of pensions. You might go, oh, actually, I don't mind a bit of risk. I understand that the market can drop 20%. And then you go look at your auto enrollment pension fund and you go, this thing's like really cautious. And that movement out of the default into a more aggressive or risky fund can produce exceptionally more returns if markets perform like they have in the past.
Yeah, and in the other direction, because like if you're closer to actually wanting to live off those funds, then you can deal with a lot less risk.
You might want to get out of the fund that they're in and be more cautious.
Yeah,
Exactly. I think that I don't think people, what's your risk appetite, and no one actually sits down and works that out.
But everyone like will lie to themselves anyway. Like it's very I can deal with it, but then when it comes to it, you can't. You don't really know that until you've been through it. So going through like a financial disaster early in life is kind of a good thing. It kind of teaches you what you like.
Forges the steel.
Yeah, I guess that Damo was talking about Amy. She said she was watching, it was, it says positive, negative, red and green, and it was green and it was just going down and down towards break even, and she bottled it. So I was thinking, it was in the red, but she just sold before it got to break even.
Yeah.
So like some people, they don't even want to see the red, whereas I've lived
look.
in the red many times. I'm familiar with the red occasionally.
But you just don't want to be looking at this. Like if the point is you don't touch it for decades, then what it's worth is irrelevant today or tomorrow. So but you just need to not look, otherwise it will. And that's why it's just like, if that's the point of that bucket, then just set it up and forget it is even there, because looking is not going to help. What action are you going to take? Like fiddling around with it is likely to make things worse rather than better.
Exactly, yeah.
That's why property is so good, I guess, because there's no live market. There's no one screaming at you what the price is. So I bet if there was, property prices would be fluctuating on by the second, right?
Yeah, exactly. Why do people succeed in property? Like there will be structural reasons for it, but I think a lot of the fact is like it forces you to buy and hold.
Yeah, you can't do much. Like you don't have much flexibility.
Even if you wanted to sell in an instant, you can't, because you've got to get a mortgage advisor and you've got to list it and you've got to wait for an offer and exchange contract.
Yeah.
By then you'd be like, I'm not panicking now.
Exactly. So the illiquidity of it, like for your friend who took 3 years to sell, that's a problem. But if as an investment, it's like, well, this is great. Like I've had times when I've just been just like, this has happened, that's happened, I can't be asked with this anymore, I just want to sell it. But if I could have done it in that moment, maybe I would have done, but I couldn't.
Yeah, hard to panic for 3 years.
Exactly.
Okay, you say one. I don't want to skip any, but you say the compounding machine. You just outlined what you mean by that. This is the maintain bucket that you just set it up, you leave it to run, and you know that long term at least you'll be okay. You'll get to a point where your wealth from assets can replace your income, most likely.
Yeah.
In your book, you say that the ability for compounding to dramatically transform our lives has been dangerously oversold. I misquoted you, but it was there or thereabouts.
More or less, yeah.
Yeah. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think like the whole put money into the market, let it compound for a long period of time. Obviously, that's a good thing to do. Not saying it's not, but what it's not going to do is change your life anytime soon. Like if you look at how long it takes, like we talked about the hockey stick thing, right? It's like, and it takes probably like 30 years at least just for that to really get going. Like in the early days of compounding, you're putting in the vast majority of it yourself, and the amount that you're getting in terms of compound returns is tiny, and obviously over time that increases. So if you've got 40 years, then that's fantastic. But I think so much personal finance advice that you see is just start doing this in your 20s, and in your 60s you'll be fine. It's like, cool, but what if you're not in your 20s? Like you can't go back in time. So what are you going to do? And even if you do start in your 20s, after 20 years, if you're forced to stop work, or you have to, or you want to stop work or whatever, 20 years isn't enough. It's not going to make that much of a difference. If you left it for another 20, it would be. But if you interrupt compounding at that point, it doesn't really work anymore. So I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm saying it's not going to be, maybe it's something to do for the future. But if you want to make a big change to your life anytime soon, it's not going to do that much for you.
Off the back of that, another well-quoted thing when it comes to compounding is people always quote the average return of the market, and they say in the last 100 years we've done 9%, so extrapolate that out.
Yeah.
Do you think that is a good assumption to make?
I think it's a risky assumption to make if you're relying on that, because like you see people sort of like talk about 9%, 10%. But if you look at what that's based on the US market over the last 100 years or whatever. That happens to be the time when the US has dominated the world. It's been the best performing market in the world for that time. So the best performing market is 10%. So if you then put everything into the US, maybe you could expect that in the future. But is the US going to continue to dominate for the next 100 years? It's highly unlikely. If you look back at the history of the world, it's just like that tends to be not how things work. So then you need to go and pick what the next best is going to be. So if you do that, maybe you'll get 10% if you manage to pick the next best performing economy for the next 100 years. Are you going to be able to do that? Probably not. So you're going to want to diversify. You'll want to put some in the US, some in Europe, some in Japan, whatever. Spread your bets. But if you're doing that, then you're obviously not going to get the return of the best anymore. You're going to get more of an average. So maybe that pulls your 10 down to a 7. And then that is all before inflation. So say inflation is 2%, which is what it's supposed to be, then like real, that's taking you down to 5. What if inflation is higher? So quite soon you kind of go from this amazing sounding headline number down to something that's less exciting. So again, it's like not saying, oh, this is all pointless, but it's saying don't do your sums on the basis of everything on this incredible run from the best in the world, where for the last however many years, everything's been structurally pushing up the value of everything.
Stress test to the downside in terms when you stress test to the upside with mortgages, you might go, what if it was 5% real, or what if it was 4%? What would that look like, and would I be saving enough?
Exactly.
So the next one you've got is work on earning more. Can you talk to us about how people would realistically do that?
Yeah, and what I really want to get across is that doesn't mean go start your own business, because I feel that can come across as the advice a lot of the time. And like, as you know, starting your own business can be an amazing thing to do, but it's not for everyone, and it's not for everyone at every stage of their life.
Not quick either.
No, exactly. So, but it doesn't have to be that. Like, it can just be getting a qualification that allows you to sort of go and get a job doing that pays you more. It can be switching industry. Like, with the same skills you've got, you could go and apply those skills in an industry that just structurally pays more. Or it can be not necessarily working harder, putting in more hours, but just working in a way where you put in more effort in the same time and work a bit more intentionally. It's like something that we've seen in our business and we talk about a lot is that it's if someone is just like, you don't have to be twice as good as everyone else. If you're just like 10%, 20% better than everyone else, it's super noticeable and you get all the opportunities. The people in our business who've like risen up and are like getting paid more than anyone else, who are like at the top, they're the ones who just like came in and like, weren't just like, this is the most incredible person I've seen in my life, but they were just consistently doing well, having ideas, picking up things and figuring them out on the fly. And it's just by doing that, it can make a radical difference. And so earning more doesn't have to mean making massive life changes. It doesn't have to mean like working all hours. But if you can just find a way of earning more, then for a start, like, there is no risk to it. Like, if you get paid more, that is a good thing. There's no risk of it going wrong. It's not reliant on anyone else. And also, it's going to have such a higher impact than anything you can do with your investments. Any time that you're spending messing around with your investment portfolio, maybe it'll make a tiny difference. It could make things worse. If you applied the same amount of time and focus to your career, to a side gig, to whatever else, it's going to pay off far more.
Yeah, there was something that someone said to me. They were like, look around where you work and see what the ceiling is and ask, am I happy with that? And then maybe just sidestep into a different kind of industry where people get paid a higher ceiling.
Yeah.
So if you work in HR for a charity, there's a ceiling. If you go and do the same for HR for Goldman Sachs, you'll probably get paid 10 times more to do the exact same job, just because that sector, that industry has higher wages and higher profits and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And I think most people see their career as something that happens to them to an extent. Like, they're waiting for opportunities, or like maybe they get a pay rise, maybe they don't, maybe there's an opportunity, maybe there's not. And I think you're whether you like it or not, you're putting so many of your hours and so much of your life energy into it. You might as well be intentional about it and believe that you have control over it. Obviously, you don't have full control over it, but just believing that you do just will make you see these opportunities like the ones you talked about. Maybe you don't want to go and work for an investment bank and you'd actually hate it, in which case, fine, don't do it. But it's just worth knowing that the opportunities are there.
And that the people that are doing those jobs that are getting paid more than you they're no different to you.
Absolutely,
they're often doing the exact same job.
Yeah.
It's just that they just so happen to be in the right location to get that opportunity.
Yeah, and most people like fell into what they're doing. Like, it's very rare, I think, for like you go and see your careers advisor and they say do this. You go, oh, okay, yeah, that's a great idea. And then it's just like most people just that's like random chance that got you to where you are. And so like maybe it is the best thing, but there's a good chance that it's also not, because it's just random.
And if you intentionally just sit down and go, wait, where am I next randomly going to fall? Maybe you'll get a better outcome than just bobbing around.
Exactly.
You then have research improve investments.
Mm-hmm. So like if you decide that sort of making any kind of investment appropriately sized is the way for you, then the way I say research it rather than do it is because I think that's where it should start. It's the difference between taking a calculated risk with some proportion of your wealth versus just like going and having a punt on something. So then that research process could go on for years before you're even in a position to have the funds to do it. And if the thought of doing any of that is just like no fun at all, like you can't bring yourself to start researching it, that's probably a sign that you shouldn't be doing it at all. And you should just focus on something else, maybe earning more, so you're putting more into the compounding side of things, and so that will get you to where you want to be.
I can't not have you here and not talk about property investment because, do you still think property is a good long-term investment?
Yeah, totally.
Done.
Easy question. Next one.
Only with finance?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting area, because I do think if you look at the long-term returns of property and the stock market, they're roundabout equivalent. Look, you can slice it in different ways depending on time periods and stuff, but it's more or less the same. In which case you go like, well, why would I even bother with property then? Because it's so much more hassle, it's so much more lumpy and illiquid and all the rest of it. But it's the leverage aspect that boosts your returns. And so I don't particularly, a lot of people get into property investment going like, I want to invest in property because I like it, I understand it, but I want to do it with cash because I don't like debt. But I think debt is largely the point of it. And you've got to use it in a sensible way and control it and all the rest of it. And it does involve risk, which is why it's in that improved bucket. But if you're not using the debt, then you're taking on quite a lot of extra work for not really any extra return.
And I think in the past, because property prices in the main just rose, it was okay to buy cash because you would know you would get a return on that. But now, let's say property prices stay flat in real terms, or they could fall backwards. If you're buying cash, your asset is declining in value or staying flat. Whereas with the leverage, and you put a tenant in that pays off the leverage, you essentially make that as the gain, don't you?
Yeah, and the whole point about having like inflation being baked into the system, then it's like, well, if you've got a debt which is fixed, so you borrow £100,000, that's always going to be £100,000. But the value of that £100,000 is going to shrink relative to the value of the asset, which will go up in line with inflation over the long term. With the income stream, the rent will go up in line with inflation over the long term, and probably your earning power as well. So whatever it is that you're using to pay the debt off, or whatever you're looking at it relative to, the debt is shrinking at quite a pace.
So you don't care about yield on day one necessarily. I mean, it'll be there, but you're not thinking, oh, this is a 5% gross yield for life. You're thinking, actually, in 20 years, it'll probably be 15% on the cash I put in.
This is it. And you've got to be careful when you talk about it, because you definitely don't want to be saying like, oh, just buy anything. It's all about the capital growth or whatever. Like, no, like you've got to be covering your costs and then some, and like, have all the protections in place. But yeah, I think, again, it's like, people obsess about small differences, like, oh, well, I get a 6% or a 7% return on day one. It's like, in 10 years, it's not going to matter, because the amount that you bought it for and your debt is fixed. And you know that over time, the value of it will go up, even if it's just in line with inflation, and the rent will go up, even if only in line with inflation. So you don't need to have a property boom. You don't need rents to go up at like 10% a year or whatever they were until about 6 months ago. It's actually better if they don't. If everything just carries on nice and easy, then over time it gets you there.
And the key bit is you've accessed that increase in inflation adjusted rentals through 25% of the purchase price of the property. You get to control the whole asset and all of the upside with a chunk in, and you use the bank's money.
Yeah, so if you say, this is a way oversimplified example, but if you say that inflation is 2% a year and property goes up by 2% a year in line with that on average, then if you put in 25% of the money, then that's 8% on your money, if you see what I mean.
Because it's a 4 times multiplier.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's lots of reasons why that's not quite true, and there's costs and stuff like that. But that's the general logic.
So even though the purchasing power in real terms of the money hasn't increased, you've got, because you've only used a quarter of the money, you have actually increased in purchasing power.
Exactly that.
I know what comments will say. They'll say, but there's interest rates on mortgages. So it's not fixed because they're applying an interest. What do you say to that?
Well, the funny thing about that is that's so much less risky than it was a couple of years ago, because when you could borrow for like sub 2%, you knew that wasn't going to be the case forever, but when was it going to stop being the case? You didn't really know. But now rates are back to close to their long-term average. Obviously, if you already owned a property and your interest rate's gone way up, that's a problem. But if you're just coming into it now, then it's like, okay, well, what's the interest rates went up by like 250% or whatever from like 2 to 5. What's the chance of that happening again? Almost nothing, because everything in the world would collapse. So it's just like there's so much less risk around that than there was. You still need to have the headroom built in. All mortgage lenders will stress test you to make sure you can deal with it. But yeah, obviously it's a risk you can't fix forever like you can in the US, but it's a lot less risky than it was a couple of years ago.
Yeah. Do you turn away deals in the past that were as next to nothing rates because you knew that if the rates went up, they weren't viable?
Yeah, we always tested things against a higher rate, because you can't assume that it's going to be there forever.
Plenty of people did.
Yeah. Because it's hard, because like there was a BBC calculator that's been up on the internet for like at least 20 years. I can just remember it being there, and it was always like, your interest rate now is this, but what would it be if it was 12%? And at the time, because this was like in the early 2000s, that was like a realistic thing that you could, but that you could look at and go, it could happen.
90s,
yeah, and because of where interest rates were at the time, when rates were like 0, you look at this 12% going like, what are you talking about? And now it's just like, well, now it feels a bit more like, well, that's only a doubling. So like, okay, maybe you could see it. But I still fail to see how rates can get there, because like, people go, oh yeah, interest rates were 15% or whatever. And they were, but they weren't for long. And they were when everyone's debt was way, way, way lower.
Yeah. For me now, the introduction of leverage to my portfolio is the high risk thing I'm chasing, because I have my equities bucket and I know that they can do a certain amount, and I have a cash flowing business that I can get money out of. What I don't have is leverage. We spend a lot of time talking about how everything is changing and the world is a different place. And I think that can be quite scary and intimidating to people who, especially just starting, they might think I've kind of missed out here. Do you have anything to say to them?
Yeah, it's funny, because I wrote my last book, The Price of Money, was like, the whole thing was like laying out how the financial system worked and how it's like structurally definitely going to collapse at some point in the future. And then at the end, it's like, but try not to worry about it. Because ultimately, like, you can't do anything about that. You've just got to control what you can control. And what I try to get across in this book is you can control more than you might think. And the things that have the best potential for like making serious changes are the things you have most control over. So I bang on about earning, because like, that's the thing that you can control the most, and it's a thing that makes a far bigger difference than whether you're making 6% or 7% in your Vanguard account or whatever. And so like, that's something you control. If you do want to go and like make these riskier bets that have a chance of paying off, if you're doing that the right way rather than taking a gamble, then that's something you have control over as well, because you're using your own knowledge and your own skills and your own time. So you can have control over all the stuff that matters. And I think I want this to come across as a hopeful book, because I think it really is. I think there's so much guilt and fear and weirdness around money that people have. Like, we're all weird about money in different ways, and it's a lot of people will just put it in the too scary box or whatever and just rather not think about it. But actually, I think there's loads you can do that will, regardless of what the markets do or whatever else, whatever happens with the national debt, you can make your life better by doing things a bit differently.
Absolute pleasure chatting to Rob. I think hopefully that'll be really useful for people that are looking to get started this year.
Speaking about very useful stuff, we've got a free newsletter which will help people sort out their financial lives. Take you from 0 to 1. There's a link in the description.